So while we're talking about TV, let's talk about another impact, major impact that TV had on film. It has to do with content. So when film came out, and I had mentioned this briefly in an earlier lecture, but when film came out, people weren't sure if you could censor it. The newspapers had been around for a long time, and people knew about the First Amendment and freedom of speech, and people were aware, although there are definitely some instances where this is not true, like take my J100 class, but for the most part, you could print what you wanted to, you could say what you wanted to, okay? Most people understand First Amendment rights, freedom of speech rights. So when film came out, people weren't entirely sure if you could do this. And again, it started with, in some ways, Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation, so controversial because it is so racist that there were states, most notably Ohio, that said, we don't want to show this movie. We want to ban this movie. And early on, the decision was that states could ban these films, but eventually this is overturned, and that the decision was, no, you just can't do this. It is free speech. People can be allowed to say what they want in a film, depict what they want in a film, as long as it is legal. And again, there were definitely issues regarding this, but for the most part, film could show what it wanted to. Now, just because it could didn't mean it did. So why is that? Well, with Birth of a Nation and some of the other films that were going on in the late teens and the early 20s, there were several groups, a large group with the Catholic Church and some other religious organizations in particular, that said these films are inappropriate and you should not show these films. And they got very upset and were going to boycott, doing lots of protesting. And the film industry made a really interesting choice. And it's one that a lot of people still don't, to this day, even understand. So I'll explain it to you. The film industry itself said, we have got to avoid controversy. If we are so controversial, people are not going to see our movies and it's going to hurt us financially. So here's what we'll do. We'll just censor ourselves. So they hired a man whose last name is Hays, and Hays created a code, the Hays Code. And the code basically said, these are things you can't do in a film. And the code was pretty severe. No graphic violence. People couldn't sleep in the same bed. There certainly was no nudity. You couldn't swear almost in any instance, a couple of words. You couldn't talk about God per se unless it was a very religious type of explanation. You couldn't do all kinds of things. And also, the good people always had to beat the bad people in the movie. That's basically this entire code. And it was very long, but everyone in the film industry agreed to abide by these rules, at least eventually. What happened was the code started in the late 1920s, but it doesn't really take root until around 1933. And then you have this period of about 30 years where virtually every film you are ever going to see has this stamp of approval, this Hays Code approval. Did you have to get it? No, but every studio did get it, and if you didn't have a studio-made film or backed film, you weren't going to get into any theaters. They owned most of the theaters anyway until the late 1940s. So basically, what they did was they created self-censorship. Okay? Now, there is a weird little period in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, and it is frequently called the pre-code era. Pre-code is usually reserved for like 1929 to 1932, and the reason is they're sound films. And even though the code existed, no one was really following it yet, and it's a fascinating period. Sometimes they'll have festivals, pre-code festivals. There's nudity in these films, drug use, A lot of salacious stuff goes on in pre-code films that you're thinking, I didn't know you could do this. Well, you could always do it. They just stopped doing it. So during this period, you don't see those things, or if you see them, they are very much hinted at. Like if there's certain types of drug use or prostitution, or someone is a gay or lesbian. So people didn't do this stuff. I mean, you could do it, but they didn't. Or they hinted at it. For example, you could hint at drug use or prostitution. If a character was gay, if a character was lesbian, they would never say that. You would have to have certain codes that said, oh, these things are happening. A lot of times it's confusing for a modern audience to be like, are they talking about drugs? Or what's going on here? I'm confused. Or is that character gay? I don't know. Back then, people knew because the different codes used to, say this is this and this is that. People were aware of what they were. But today's audience would just rather you told them. So during this long period, this code is in charge. So why does it break down? It starts to break down in the 1950s because of, you guessed it, because of TV. Okay? TV, again, offering you things for free. Film's got to figure out how to get you. We talked about color, we talked about aspect ratio, we talked about 3D. They also figured we can be more violent. We can be more sexy. Okay? Now, why is that? Well, again, even though there's this Hays Code, it's done internally. TV, on the other hand, is regulated by the government, by the Federal Communications Commission. And the FCC, although it changes radically over the years, is in charge of what you can and cannot do. And in the 1950s, it is very tight what you cannot do on TV. They are not at all concerned with TV being a little boring. Everybody's watching TV. So what if it's boring? So what if there's not violence? So what if it's not sexy? Who cares? We're still winning, right? How hard do you have to try if all you have to do is show up and win? Film, on the other hand, says, no, we got to be more violent, we got to be more sexy. Then we get to the 1960s. Now, we've discussed the 1960s before. It's a time of turmoil and change, and youth culture is becoming really important to society, particularly in America, and they are demanding change. So the films start to even become more so. The violence becomes more realistic, more bloody, okay? The sex becomes more graphic. There is now nudity being shown starting in the mid-1960s. These things are starting to happen. Well, this Hays Code is now problematic. So here's what happens. To allow this freedom for the directors, but to still be safe and self-censored, the Motion Picture Association of America creates a rating system. And you know the rating system. It's originally it's G, then it was GP, but PG, R, and X. X got co-opted by the pornography industry, so they kept working with this, A and some other things, and eventually they came up with NC-17. And they created this rating system. Again, it's self-censorship. You and I could make a film right now, put anything we want into it, and not get the film rated and distribute our film. There's a problem, however. Virtually no movie theater chain will run a movie if it's not rated. And a lot of them won't run movies that are rated NC-17. Okay? And this is all going to come back to be important. In the 1980s, they create a new one called PG-13. Okay? So, what does this mean about our director and the director language? It means during this period, the director is incredibly hampered, not being able to do what he or she wants. Alfred Hitchcock is basically directing movies, and people think his films are brilliant, with one hand tied behind his back. They're not the films that look exactly like how he wants them to do. So much has to be implied. Now, a lot of people really appreciate that. He showed very well you can make films that were scary, weird, freaky, disturbing, without having graphic violence and nudity and language. You could do it, right? And a lot of directors did it, and it's an impressive period of time. However, it did mean that certain choices they would have made, they couldn't, right? Then this rating system comes along and it frees them up in a great way in terms of they can do things they couldn't do before. Now, some people don't like that, and I can argue both sides pretty easily. However, it still hampers them for a couple of reasons. For starters, the rating system, and I'm going to give a link to a part of a documentary called This Film Is Not Yet Rated. It's a brilliant film, and it's a documentary about the rating system. The rating system is incredibly arbitrary. It's made up by a small group of people whose names are kept private, but it's supposed to be parents, but it frequently isn't. And they just make up a choice, like, oh, this one looks like an R. They don't have a hard set of rules, and the rules change all the time, and they are harder on independent films versus big studio films. Some films that you're like, how did that not be an NC-17, or why is that an R, or why is that a PG-13? It's incredibly arbitrary, right? So while it gave them freedom, they still had to adhere to this rating system, today's directors, and you don't want to get an NC-17. So you've got to make sure that your film fits inside here. And if your film is a big enough budget, it usually needs to fall in the PG or PG-13 area, right? Because although R-rated movies are now making tons and tons of money, it's still the sweet spot if you want like kids and stuff to go. You're not going to see a Star Wars movie that's rated R. That's just not going to happen. So the director is still basically working with one hand tied behind his or her back because they have to fit this rating system. And again, they don't have to, right? It's still self-censorship, but because it's a closed system, if you want to get into a theater, you have to be rated. So you have to go through this process. TV remains regulated, at least broadcast TV, by the FCC. That is quickly breaking down. And again, this fight between TV and film continues to this day, although the lines are now, in the last 5 years, so blurred. It looks like we're heading toward a change that will make a lot of this look incredibly antiquated just in the next couple of years. But the important thing to remember is how this basically affects the director's choice when conveying meaning, idea, concept to you.